This video is brought to you by Brilliant. In the past few months, overcapacity has become the new buzzword in the US-China trade war. The term was used multiple times by EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen late last year, before being popularised by US Trade Secretary Janet Yellen during a trip to Beijing in late March. And it's since become the White House's favourite way of dissing China's trade practices without sounding too rude or explicitly protectionist. Unsurprisingly, the CCP have made it clear that they don't agree with the overcapacity narrative, and they're not going to listen to the West's economic advice about rebalancing their economy away from exports towards consumer-driven economic growth. From Beijing's perspective, the West has been complaining about China's allegedly unfair trade practices for at least a decade now, and overcapacity is just a new way of framing old complaints. Instead, the CCP argues that the overcapacity narrative is being used to justify Western protectionism, which will end up undermining the green transition and disadvantaging the world's poorest countries. However, while it's probably true that some of the world's poorest countries might actually benefit from overcapacity and super cheap Chinese exports, anxieties about overcapacity have now spread to middle-income global south countries, including Turkey, Brazil, Mexico and Chile, who've all imposed steep tariffs on Chinese imports to protect their domestic industries in the past few weeks. So in this video, we're going to explain what exactly is meant by overcapacity, why it's such a hot topic in geopolitics at the moment, and why it's straining relations between China and parts of the global south. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start by explaining this notion of overcapacity. Now, when commentators talk about overcapacity, they often confuse two different things. Some commentators use the idea of overcapacity to essentially complain merely about the fact that China produces and exports a lot of stuff, and the accompanying fact that the West has become dependent on China for certain exports. However, there's a better defined notion of overcapacity, which complains not just about the fact that China produces and exports a lot of stuff, but that this productive capacity isn't matched by an equivalent amount of demand for imports. To be fair, China does indeed export a lot more than it imports, as evidenced by its enormous and persistent trade surpluses. This is largely because Chinese households and workers aren't paid enough to buy a corresponding amount of imports, which is why domestic consumption makes up such a tiny fraction of China's overall GDP. If Chinese workers were paid more and China imported more stuff, China's trade practices would probably be a less controversial topic in global politics. Take the US-China trade tensions over solar panels, for instance. Some American politicians are worried that the US is becoming too dependent on China for solar panels. But if China's booming solar panel exports were matched by an equivalent demand from Chinese consumers for new imports, then it wouldn't be as much of a problem. Americans could then just sell something else, like wind turbines, to these newly empowered Chinese consumers, balancing out the overall trade balance and creating a healthy and mutual dependency. However, that's not what's happening. Instead, China is trying to manufacture solar panels, wind turbines, and basically everything else. China's booming exports aren't creating an equivalent amount of demand for new imports, which means that non-Chinese businesses are struggling to find demand, and everyone is becoming dependent on China for nearly everything. Governments across the world have wised up to this and responded with protectionism. Obviously, this has become a real issue in the West, who are now worried about deindustrialization, and the IMF has called on China to rebalance its economy towards domestic demand. Unfortunately, this hasn't happened, and Xi has instead started talking about new productive forces as his preferred remedy for China's economic woes. Here, Xi is basically saying he wants to eschew consumer stimulus and stick with export-led manufacturing, but with a renewed emphasis on high-tech and strategically significant industries like electric vehicles, semiconductors, and AI. As you'd expect, this policy has sparked some pushback, especially from the US and Europe, where politicians are fretting about the decline of their national manufacturing industries. But perhaps more worryingly for the CCP, in the past few months, especially since Xi doubled down on his export-led growth strategy, anxieties about Chinese overcapacity have apparently spread to the so-called global south. Many Global South countries have recently introduced tariffs or other trade restrictions on Chinese imports to protect their national industries. Indonesia has banned the export of certain raw materials to force companies, usually Chinese ones, to shift their manufacturing to Indonesia. And late last year, both Vietnam and Thailand opened anti-dumping investigations into Chinese steel products after domestic steel manufacturers complained that they were being undercut by Chinese imports. More recently, Mexico, Chile and Brazil have hiked, and in some cases more than doubled, tariffs on Chinese steel products over the last few weeks. And Colombia looks set to follow suit after its largest national steelmaker, Paz del Rio, complained to the government. Perhaps most strikingly, over the weekend, Turkey announced that it would be imposing an additional 40% tariff on Chinese EV imports, which threatened to undermine Turkey's own budding domestic EV industry. For context, Erdogan has made it clear that he wants Turkey to have its own EV industry, and the Turkish government has actively supported Turkish EV manufacturer TOGG for the past few years. Turkey's first EV, the TOGG T10X, was released in late 2023, and Erdogan has been giving TOGG cars to various Gulf state leaders as part of his new charm offensive in the Middle East. This has apparently provoked some anxiety in Beijing, and the CCP has started warning other Global South countries that the overcapacity narrative could be weaponized against them in the future. On Tuesday, for instance, the Chinese ambassador to India tried to reframe the debate as a battle between developed and developing countries, tweeting that, quote, "We the Global South will definitely say no." Now, it's important not to overstate all this. While it's clearly true that some of the wealthier Global South countries are anxious about Chinese overcapacity, other Global South countries, especially the poorer ones, are actually pretty keen on overcapacity, because it means cheaper Chinese imports. If you're a very poor country, you're probably not worried about protecting or developing your national industry. Because, well, you probably don't have one to protect in the first place, and your immediate priority is buying cheap imports to improve your citizens' quality of life. For these countries, Chinese overcapacity in stuff like solar panels is a godsend, because it means cheap solar panels and therefore cheap energy. Nonetheless, as countries across the world become increasingly focused on protecting their domestic industries, which seems to be happening, anxieties about Chinese overcapacity will only increase, straining relations between not just China and the West, but also those middle-income countries with less well-established industrial bases. Now, understanding exactly what has or is going to happen here can be a little tricky, requiring you to evaluate lots of information from different, often partial sources. It would be sensible then to begin improving your critical thinking skills so that you can keep sharp and better understand what's going on. And well, our sponsor Brilliant.org can help you do just that. Brilliant is the online learning platform that's designed specifically to teach you everything from maths, data analysis, programming and AI from the ground up. You don't need a fancy degree or to have dedicated hundreds of hours to studying any of these. All you need is a device with an internet connection and a few spare minutes a day. And with your spare few minutes, you'll learn by actually doing, with Brilliant providing hands-on lessons that let you play around with concepts, a method that has been shown to be 6 times more effective than just watching lectures. What makes this even better is that this content is created by an award-winning team of teachers, researchers and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft and more. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Just click on the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.